The window that watched me sleep. Chapter 1. The first night. When I moved into the old house, I didn't think much about the large, ornate window in my bedroom. It overlooked the backyard, a stretch of untended grass leading into dense woods. At first glance, the window seemed charming, its wooden frame slightly worn, its glass panes imperfect and wavy. But it wasn't long before I began to notice the feeling. That first night, as I settled into the unfamiliar bed, I couldn't shake the sensation that the window wasn't just a piece of architecture. It felt aware. The moonlight streaming through it seemed sharper than it should have been, casting long, angled shadows across the room. I pulled the covers up to my chin, telling myself it was just nerves. After all, I had never lived in a house this old. Maybe I was spooking myself. But the feeling didn't go away. As the hours crept by, every creak of the house seemed amplified. Every faint gust of wind outside the window felt personal, as if it were trying to get my attention. I found myself lying there, staring at the ceiling, refusing to glance toward the window for fear of what I might see. At some point I must have dozed off, but my sleep was fitful. Dreams of shadowy figures standing just outside the glass plagued me. When I jolted awake in the middle of the night, my heart racing, I could have sworn I saw something move, just a flicker, in the corner of my vision. But when I turned to look directly at the window, nothing was there. Just the moonlight, the woods, and that strange, too-perfect stillness. The rest of the night passed in restless silence, but by morning I felt like I hadn't slept at all. I told myself it was just the stress of moving, the strange new environment, but deep down I knew something was off. The window wasn't just watching, it was waiting. Chapter 2. A flicker in the glass. The next day I tried to brush off the unease. After all, I'd only just moved in. Adjusting would take time. The morning light flooding through the window seemed harmless enough, even comforting. I told myself that what had happened the night before was just a trick of my imagination. Still, I couldn't entirely shake the sense of being watched. As evening fell, the old house grew quiet again, the usual sounds of the world outside softening until all that remained was the occasional creak of wood or faint rustle of wind. I caught myself glancing at the window more often than I wanted to admit, half expecting to see something reflected in the glass, something that shouldn't have been there. By nightfall, the atmosphere had changed. The moon rose high, casting that same unnervingly sharp light into the room. I decided to test my nerves. I pulled the curtains aside and stood before the window, gazing out into the yard and the woods beyond. Nothing moved, not a single leaf, not a bird, not an animal, just the still, moonlit grass and the line of dark trees. It should have reassured me. It didn't. I turned away, pulling the curtains closed, but I caught it, just for a second. A faint flicker, a shift of light on the glass, as if something had moved behind me. I froze, my hand still clutching the curtain. Slowly, I turned back toward the window. Nothing was there. This time, I knew I hadn't imagined it. The flicker was real, and it came from inside the house. My heart raced, and I backed away from the window. For a long moment, I stood in the center of the room, the whistle of wind outside the only sound. I didn't look at the window again that night. but the feeling stayed with me. Whatever it was, it had made itself known, and I was certain it wasn't going to stop. Chapter 3. The Lock That Never Held. The following evening, I decided to put my nerves at ease by checking the window lock. I don't know why it had never occurred to me before, but the idea of making sure the latch was secure felt comforting, rational. After all, a locked window meant nothing could get in. But when I approached the window and examined the mechanism, I realized the lock didn't sit properly in its frame. It wasn't broken exactly, but it didn't hold. The bolt barely engaged, slipping loose with the faintest push. I spent the better part of an hour tinkering with it, tightening screws and trying to wedge it into a more secure position. Nothing worked. The lock seemed resistant to every attempt, as though the wood and metal had conspired against me. Finally, with a frustrated sigh, I gave up. The window was closed tightly, but that was the best I could do. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. The house was in a secluded area and no one would be prowling around in the middle of the night. Yet, as I lay in bed that evening, the thought nagged at me. I couldn't help but picture the latch slipping free, the window swinging open silently while I slept. The night grew colder and a faint breeze crept through the room. I pulled the covers up and tried to relax, focusing on the rhythmic ticking of the clock on my nightstand, but then, just as I felt myself starting to drift off, there was a soft click. It was subtle, barely audible, but it sent a jolt through my chest. I opened my eyes, staring into the darkness. The click came again. This time I recognized it. It was the sound of the lock slipping loose. My heart pounded as I turned my head toward the window. The curtains were still drawn, but I could see them shifting slightly, as though stirred by a faint draft. Slowly, I sat up, my breathing shallow and quick. The click came once more, followed by a soft creak. I froze. For a moment, I considered turning on the bedside lamp, but something stopped me. I don't know if it was fear of what I might see, or the irrational hope that staying still would make it go away. I stayed motionless, straining my ears for any other sound. When nothing more happened, I forced myself to lie back down. Though sleep never came, I remained wide awake until the first hints of dawn lit the room. Only then did I muster the courage to pull back the curtains. The window was closed, the latch loose but in place. Yet I knew what I had heard, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had tested it. Something that wouldn't stop until it got inside. Chapter 4. Shadows Behind the Pane. The first thing I noticed that night was how the shadows seemed to shift. Not in the way shadows normally stretch or waver when a light source moves. No, these shadows were deliberate, calculated. I pulled the curtains shut, hoping that if I couldn't see them, they couldn't see me. But the feeling was still there. Even through the thin barrier of fabric, I knew something was just on the other side of the glass. The room was quiet enough that I could hear my own heartbeat, a steady drumbeat against the unnerving silence. My thoughts raced. Maybe I was imagining it all. Maybe the stress of the move and my lack of sleep were playing tricks on me. Or maybe, just maybe, something was truly there. I tried to distract myself by reading, but I couldn't focus. My eyes kept darting toward the window, half expecting the curtains to part on their own. They didn't, but that didn't bring comfort. In fact, the stillness only made things worse. The air felt heavy, as if the entire room was holding its breath. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned off the lamp and lay back in bed, staring at the ceiling. That's when I saw it. Just a faint movement from the corner of my eye. A ripple, almost imperceptible, but enough to make my skin crawl. Slowly, I turned my head. The curtains remained closed, yet the outline of the window seemed darker than it should have been. The shadows were no longer behind the glass. They were closer. I sat up, every muscle in my body tensed. My hand hovered over the bedside lamp, but something stopped me from turning it on. I didn't want to know what I might see. Instead, I sat there in the darkness, my breathing shallow, waiting for something, anything to happen. Minutes stretched into hours, and still I didn't move. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me and I lay back down, my eyes never leaving the window's outline. By the time morning came, the room was bathed in soft sunlight. The shadows were gone, but the memory of their presence lingered. I promised myself I'd find a way to stop this. The window wasn't just a nuisance anymore. It was a threat. Chapter 5. The Whispering Breeze. The night started innocently enough. The house was quiet and a faint breeze slipped through the trees outside. I'd left the window closed as usual, but tonight I swore I could hear something different in the rustling of the wind. It wasn't the usual soothing sound. It carried a subtle, almost musical note, like a distant whisper threading through the branches. At first, I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks, the old house amplifying the sound. But as the night deepened, the whispering grew more distinct. It wasn't random, it followed a rhythm, repeating patterns that didn't belong to nature. I turned off the lights, hoping the darkness would help me focus and understand what I was hearing. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring toward the window. The curtains were still closed, but the faint breeze seemed to lift them ever so slightly, just enough to hint at movement behind them. My stomach tightened. The whispering wasn't coming from outside. It was in the room, circling me, closing in. A sudden gust pushed the curtains outward, and my heart leapt. It felt as though something was about to step through the glass. My breathing quickened, and I reached for the nearest object, a small lamp, and held it tightly, unsure of what I'd do if something emerged. But the gust settled. The curtains fell back into place. The whispering softened, fading into the faint hum of the house at night. I let out a shaky breath, lowering the lamp. Whatever it wasn't here, at least not physically. Yet the sense of presence remained. The whispering breeze had stirred something, and I knew it would return. That night I barely slept. I listened for the whispers, half hoping they wouldn't come back, half fearing they would. By dawn, I felt as though I'd been awake for days. The sunlight streaming into the room seemed brighter than ever, almost blinding. But as much as I wanted to forget the night's events, I couldn't shake the feeling that the breeze, the whispers, and the restless presence were all connected, and that the window knew more than it was letting on. Chapter 6. The Silent Watcher. By the time I noticed the pattern, it was too late to feel comforted by logic. The sounds, the movements, the flickers of light that shouldn't have been there, they all pointed to something deliberate. But when you're alone in the dark, how do you rationalize what can't be explained? The room felt smaller that night. The air was thick, the silence oppressive. I didn't bother closing the curtains this time. What was the point? They did little to shield me from whatever was out there, or in here. So instead, I sat on the edge of the bed, the whistle of the faint breeze brushing my face as I stared at the window. Nothing moved. No shadows crossed the glass, but I could feel it. A presence, steady and unwavering, watching. Not like the subtle unease I'd felt before, but something deeper. I started to wonder if it had been there all along, just more patient than I could ever have imagined. The thought that I was never truly alone sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to scream, to demand it reveal itself. Instead, I whispered, "What do you want?" My voice was so faint I barely recognized it. The room held its breath, no sound in response. Yet the feeling grew heavier, pressing down on my chest. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. Time felt distorted, irrelevant. The sense of being watched didn't waver, and the weight of it bore down on me until exhaustion crept in. I lay back on the bed, not daring to close my eyes, but even with them open, I couldn't see it, just that window, unchanged yet undeniably present. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I woke with the sun streaming in, the oppressive atmosphere gone. The watcher, silent as ever, had left. If it had ever truly left at all. Chapter 7. When the curtains moved. I had grown used to the unsettling presence behind the glass, the faint whispers, the shadows that never seemed to sit still. But that night, something changed. For the first time, the barrier that separated me from whatever watched was breached. It began as a soft rustle, not the creak of wood or the moan of wind that I had come to expect. It was the sound of fabric shifting, sliding across the sill. My breath caught in my throat and I froze. Slowly I turned my head toward the window, dreading what I might see. The curtains were moving, not fully, not violently, but just enough to send my pulse racing. They shifted as though brushed by unseen hands, smooth, deliberate. I told myself it was the breeze again, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The air was still, the room stiflingly quiet. Whatever had caused them to move was no trick of the wind. I stayed in bed, unable to look away. The curtains continued their subtle motion, as though inviting me to pull them back to see what lay beyond. But I couldn't. My hands trembled at the thought of revealing what was on the other side. I sat there, the seconds stretching into minutes, until finally the movement stopped. Relief was short-lived. The room grew colder, and a faint pressure settled over me. It wasn't just the curtains now. The entire house seemed to hold its breath, waiting. I lay down, clutching the covers, and squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to believe it was over. By morning, the curtains were still, the window unchanged, but the memory of their silent, deliberate movement lingered. It was no longer just a feeling of being watched. It was a presence, active and aware. I knew then that whatever lived in that window had begun to cross the threshold, and it would not stop. Chapter 8. The Light That Fled. That evening, a strange phenomenon occurred. I had been doing everything possible to maintain some semblance of normalcy, leaving the lights on, keeping my phone nearby, streaming movies just to fill the silence. But all at once, every source of light in the room dimmed. At first, I thought it was a power surge, a momentary flicker that would quickly correct itself. But the lights didn't just flicker. They faded, gradually, until the room was steeped in an unnatural, oppressive darkness. My desk lamp, my phone screen, even the flashlight I kept by the bed, everything grew weaker, as though the light was being swallowed. I moved toward the window. Normally, the moonlight offered some relief, even if it came with shadows, but tonight there was no glow, no glimmer through the panes. The glass appeared black and impenetrable, more a wall than a window. I pressed my hand to it, feeling the coldness, but the light didn't return. Instead, I saw my faint reflection, barely outlined in the dark glass, and something else behind me, a shadow that shouldn't have been there. My breath hitched. I spun around, my heart racing, but the room was empty. The shadow was gone, or had never been. I turned back to the window. Now, faint shapes seemed to shift beyond the pane. I couldn't tell if they were outside, inside, or part of the glass itself. Whatever they were, they moved with intention, slow and fluid, like smoke curling in water. I grabbed the flashlight, praying it would cut through the blackness. But when I switched it on, the beam barely extended past my hand. It was as if the darkness absorbed it. Panicking, I aimed it at the window, hoping to chase away the shapes. Instead, the light revealed something worse. Handprints. Smudges that hadn't been there before, streaked across the glass as if someone or something had been pressing against it from the outside. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. My breathing was shallow, my chest tight. I wanted to run, to hide, but I couldn't look away. The smudges faded before my eyes, and as they disappeared, the light began to return. The lamp on the desk flickered to life, my phone screen brightened, and the room settled into its familiar, uneasy stillness. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of the room, watching the window until the first rays of morning sunlight spilled through the glass. The handprints were gone. The room was quiet. But I knew that light was no longer safe. It could flee just as easily as it returned, and when it did, I would be left in the dark with whatever waited there. Chapter 9: Reflections in the Dark. That night, I couldn't stop myself from standing at the window again. It had become a ritual of sorts, facing the darkness, hoping it wouldn't look back. But this time, when I stared into the glass, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Faint outlines, as if the surface of the window wasn't just reflecting my bedroom, but something beyond it. Something hidden in the dark. I leaned closer, trying to make out what I was seeing. The outlines became clearer. A chair, a table, objects that didn't belong to my room. It was as if the window was showing me another place, a shadowy world just beyond the glass. My reflection was still there, faintly visible, but the shapes behind it moved, slowly. I reached out and touched the glass. It was cold, almost painfully so. My reflection seemed to ripple, and for a split second, I thought I saw a face staring back at me. A pale, unfamiliar face, its eyes wide and unblinking. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The face vanished, leaving only my own reflection and the shifting shadows of the room behind me. I wanted to run, to get away from that window. But the longer I stared, the more it felt like it was calling to me, pulling me closer. The room grew colder, the air heavier. I could feel the presence of something watching, waiting. The shadows behind the glass weren't just reflections. They were alive. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed, the window's dark surface always in the corner of my vision. I kept telling myself it was just a trick of the light, a trick of my tired mind. But deep down, I knew the truth. The window wasn't just watching me. It was showing me a world I was never meant to see. Chapter 10. A Face in the Glass. The night was quieter than usual, which only made me more uneasy. I had grown accustomed to the creaks and whispers that filled the house after dark, but tonight they were absent. The stillness felt unnatural, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I turned off the lights and stood in the center of the room, facing the window. My heart pounded, but I needed to see. I needed to know. Slowly, I approached the window. The moonlight barely penetrated the glass, leaving it murky and opaque. As I leaned closer, I saw the faint outline of my own reflection staring back. At first, everything seemed normal. The same dark hair, the same weary eyes. But then something shifted. My reflection smiled. I staggered back, my heart racing. My lips hadn't moved, but the face in the glass continued to grin, the expression widening into something grotesque. I wanted to run, to leave the room, but my legs wouldn't move. The reflection tilted its head, as if mocking my fear, and then it began to change. Its features distorted, melting and reforming into a face I didn't recognize. Pale skin, hollow cheeks, eyes that burned with an unnatural light. The smile faded, replaced by an expression of cold, unyielding malice. It raised a hand, and so did I, though I hadn't intended to. My reflection mimicked my every move, but with a delay that made it feel wrong, as if it were trying to remember how to imitate me. I pressed my hands against the glass, desperate to understand what was happening. The cold seeped into my skin, and for a moment I thought I felt something on the other side, a hand pressing back. The sensation was brief, but it sent a jolt through my entire body. The face in the glass leaned closer, its eyes locking onto mine. It mouthed words I couldn't hear, but I knew they weren't meant for me. They were meant for whatever was watching. As suddenly as it had appeared, the strange reflection vanished. My own face returned, pale and frightened, the grin gone. I stumbled back, my legs finally responding. I didn't look at the window again that night. I couldn't. But the memory of that other face, that impossible, hateful grin, stayed with me long after the sun rose. Chapter 11. The Shattering Truth. By now I had grown accustomed to the terror that came with the night. The shifting shadows, the whispers, the strange faces in the glass. None of it seemed surprising anymore. But that night, the window offered something I wasn't ready for. Something that made all the previous horrors pale in comparison. I remember sitting on the floor, my back pressed against the opposite wall, staring at the window. The curtains were pulled aside, and I could see the faint reflection of the room behind me. I told myself I wouldn't move no matter what. I needed to prove to myself that the window held no real power, that everything I'd seen and heard was just my mind playing tricks. It started slowly. The reflection began to ripple like a stone dropped into still water. I clenched my fists, refusing to look away. The ripples grew more pronounced, and the reflection of my room began to distort. The furniture warped, the edges of the walls stretched, and the glass itself seemed to bow inward. I wanted to close my eyes, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot. Then, without warning, the glass cracked. The sound was sharp and sudden, like a gunshot in the silence. I flinched, my heart pounding. A thin fracture appeared in the pane, running diagonally across its surface. The distortion stopped, and for a moment everything was still. I should have left then. I should have run out of the room, out of the house, but I didn't. Instead, I watched as the crack began to spread. More lines appeared, spidering outward. The glass shuddered, the entire window groaning under some unseen pressure. And then it happened. The glass shattered outward, a cascade of glittering shards flying into the night. I scrambled back, shielding my face as the pieces hit the floor with a sound like rainfall. The cold night air rushed into the room, and with it came a noise, an inhuman, guttural growl. It wasn't the sound of the wind or the creak of the house. It was alive. I turned toward the now open window, and there, standing in the frame, was a figure. It was shrouded in shadow, its features indistinct, but its eyes, those eyes, burned with a pale, unnatural light. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, staring at me. For the first time, I understood what had been happening. The window hadn't been watching me. It had been waiting, cracking, splintering, until it could no longer hold back whatever was on the other side. I realized then that the window wasn't a barrier. It was a door, and it had just been unlocked. Chapter 12: The Voice Beyond the Window. The room felt emptier after the glass shattered, as though the broken window had taken something tangible with it. I cleaned up the shards and tried to convince myself that it was just glass, nothing more. But as I stood there staring at the jagged edges of the remaining pane, a sound rose out of the silence. It wasn't the creak of the house settling or the distant call of an animal. It was a voice. Samaral Village? At first it was faint, more of a vibration in the air than an actual sound. I froze, straining to hear. The voice became clearer but not louder. It was soft, deliberate, each word spaced apart as if it took great effort to speak. I couldn't understand what it was saying, but I knew it wasn't speaking to me. I stepped back from the window, my heart pounding. The voice seemed to slip through the cracks, filling the room without echoing. I tried to block it out by covering my ears, but it was inside my head now. I could feel the words, even if I couldn't comprehend them. The room darkened. It was the middle of the night, but this was more than the absence of light. It was as if the space around me was folding in, the walls pressing closer, the ceiling lower. The voice grew steadier, its tone shifting from strained to commanding. I still couldn't understand the language, but the intent was clear. It wasn't a plea or a warning. I ran to the door, fumbling with the handle, desperate to escape. As I turned it, the voice reached a crescendo, and for the first time, I felt the weight of eyes on me. Eyes that didn't blink, that didn't need to blink. I couldn't see them, but I knew they were there, piercing through the darkness. Finally, the door flew open and I stumbled into the hallway, slamming it shut behind me. The voice didn't follow me, but its presence lingered. I pressed my back to the door, trembling, unable to catch my breath. Whatever was beyond the window had crossed the threshold. It had found its way inside. I stood there for what felt like hours, the distant voice now a faint hum. When I finally dared to peek back into the room, the light was gone. The jagged edges of the window glinted faintly, and the air was still. But I knew better. The voice wasn't gone. It had only quieted, waiting for the next time I dared to come close. Chapter 13. Midnight's Staring Eyes. The clock on my nightstand struck midnight, its quiet chime seeming louder in the oppressive silence of the room. I didn't flinch. I didn't move. My eyes remained locked on the window, or rather, on what had become of it. No longer just a barrier between the inside and outside, it now seemed like a portal, an invitation. I had moved the bed further from the window after the last incident, but distance didn't help. The same presence hung in the air, thick and unyielding. As I sat in the dim light of the bedside lamp, I could feel the weight of eyes. They weren't watching from behind the window anymore. They were here, in the room, staring at me from every shadowy corner. At first, I tried to ignore them. I focused on the steady tick of the clock, willing the minutes to pass faster. But the feeling only grew stronger, the unseen gazes pressing down on me like a physical force. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was tired, that I just needed to sleep. But no amount of rationalizing could erase the sensation of those unblinking eyes. Eventually, I couldn't take it any longer. I turned toward the window, expecting to see the dark outline of the shattered pane. Instead, I saw something far worse. Reflected in the glass were pairs of glowing eyes, not one or two, but dozens. They floated in the reflection, unblinking, arranged in no particular order. They didn't belong to any visible forms, just the eyes, staring directly at me. My breath caught, and I instinctively reached for the lamp. The moment my hand touched it, the eyes blinked as one, and the room plunged into darkness. The lamp had been fine moments ago, but now it wouldn't turn on. I scrambled for my phone, but its screen remained black. The clock had stopped ticking. The room was utterly still, save for the faint sound of my own heartbeat. A rustling sound came from the corner of the room, followed by a faint shuffle. The eyes, now visible only in the faint moonlight filtering through the window, shifted slightly. They weren't just reflections anymore. They were moving. I pressed my back against the wall, whispering a silent prayer. The eyes continued to shift, inching closer, the shadows deepening with each passing second. I shut my eyes tightly, refusing to look. When I opened them again, the eyes were gone. The room was just as it had been, the clock ticking once more, the faint glow of my phone screen returning. But the memory of those staring eyes, that overwhelming sense of being surrounded, stayed with me long after the night ended. Chapter 14. The Final Blink. The air grew heavier as the night deepened. I hadn't slept in what felt like days, but the fear had robbed me of any sense of time. I sat motionless in the center of the room, staring at the jagged remnants of the window. The faint glow of moonlight barely illuminated the floor, leaving most of the room shrouded in deep shadows. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside felt amplified. I wanted to tell myself it was over, that nothing else could happen, but I knew better. The window had stopped being a mere object long ago. It was a presence, and it wasn't finished. Around midnight, I noticed the darkness seemed thicker, more palpable. It was as if the shadows were pooling, stretching out from the corners of the room toward the window. My breath caught as I realized the shards of glass that remained in the frame were beginning to shimmer. They reflected not the room, but something else. Something moving. I crawled backward, keeping my eyes on the glass. At first, the reflections were vague shapes, indistinct and swirling, but slowly they took form. Faces, unfamiliar and contorted, pressed against the remaining pieces. Their mouths opened and closed silently, and their eyes stared straight at me. I felt my heart pound harder, my pulse a drumbeat in the suffocating silence. Then, all at once, the faces vanished, the glass went dark, and the shadows that had been creeping across the floor froze in place. I held my breath, waiting, listening. The silence was absolute, oppressive. It stretched on and on, until I thought my own breathing would break it. And then, a single sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping. I turned toward the window, my hands shaking. A shadow moved across the cracked glass, and I realized it wasn't outside. It was here, in the room with me. A pair of eyes blinked in the darkness. They didn't belong to the faces I'd seen before. These were larger, more piercing, filled with an intelligence and malice that made my chest tighten. The blinking was slow, deliberate, as if the eyes were savoring my fear. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I backed into the far corner of the room, curling into myself, trying to make myself as small as possible. The blinking grew faster, the shadows shifting and twisting around the edges of my vision. I closed my eyes, telling myself it wasn't real, that it was all in my head. When I opened them again, the room was still. The light of dawn was breaking, casting faint golden rays through the broken window. The glass was still shattered, but the eyes were gone. The shadows had receded, and the oppressive silence had lifted. I sat there until the sun fully rose, my mind racing. The blinking, the eyes, the faces, none of it made sense. But I knew one thing for certain. The window wasn't done with me yet. Chapter 15. Dawn through the broken pane. The first light of dawn crept through the shattered window, illuminating the room in a soft, golden hue. For the first time in weeks, the house felt quiet. Not the oppressive silence of before, but a stillness that hinted at peace. I sat on the floor, my back against the far wall, watching as the sunlight stretched across the floorboards, erasing the shadows one by one. The events of the previous night weighed heavily on my mind. The blinking eyes, the faces in the glass, the strange, suffocating darkness. I couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. But now, as the morning light filled the room, it felt as though the house had let out a long, shuddering breath. Whatever had lingered here, whatever had pressed itself against that window, seemed to have receded. I stood slowly, my legs stiff and unsteady. The floor was littered with shards of glass, their edges catching the sunlight and scattering faint rainbows across the walls. Carefully, I picked my way through the mess and approached the window frame. The glass was gone, leaving only the warped wood and a faint chill from the morning air. I leaned out slightly, looking down at the backyard. The grass was damp with dew, and the woods beyond were still, their tangled branches glowing softly in the dawn. I thought back to the first night in this house, when the window had seemed nothing more than a quaint architectural feature. How long ago that felt now. In that time, I had come to fear the window, its presence, its strange reflections, its inexplicable movements. But as I stood there, the light warming my face, I felt something new. Relief. The window no longer watched. The faces were gone. The air was clear and the whispers had faded. I didn't know what had changed or why the presence had finally lifted, but I didn't question it. I let myself believe for just a moment that it was truly over. I turned away from the window and began gathering the scattered glass, carefully placing the shards into a box. As I worked, the sunlight continued to grow stronger, brightening the room until it felt entirely different. It wasn't the same house anymore. It wasn't the same window. By the time the floor was clear, the morning had fully arrived. I stood once more at the window frame, looking out at the world. The shadows that had haunted me were gone, and though the memory of them remained, they felt distant, like the remnants of a fading dream. The window was still broken, but it no longer held power over me. I took a deep breath, the cool morning air filling my lungs, and I felt a small, cautious sense of hope. The dawn had come, and with it, the promise of something new.